We are joined together in covenant. We are joined together in covenant to each other in this congregation and by a larger covenant to all the other Unitarian Universalists of the country, of the world. As such, we are called to help each other, to be brother and sister to each other, to stand for our principles. May it be so. May we do this today and always. America is sick. America is in pain. We are suffering through a pandemic where most of the deaths could have been prevented if our national government had acted differently. We're suffering through the early stages of recession, brought on in part by that pandemic. We are suffering through the painful opening of white people's eyes to the horrors of white supremacy and the hard work ahead of us to try to heal from that. Our democracy is under attack. State after state has put up barriers to prevent certain people from voting or from having their votes count. The least democratic institutions, the Electoral College, the federal courts, the Senate, have inordinate power. Who's going to save us? Not the Justice Department, not this Justice Department, which seems to have forgotten its purpose. Not the president, who's fighting for his job and his perks and pays no attention to the people who voted against him. Not the federal legislature, where the Senate refuses to even vote on bills that pass the House. Not the Supreme Court, which infamously ruled that corporations are people with free speech rights in the form of unlimited spending. Not the Supreme Court, which found the Voting Rights Act was no longer constitutional. The Supreme Court, which decided that the federal government checking on state legislation that restricted voting rights was a violation of the rights of those states. Not the Supreme Court, which then refused to even consider gerrymandering as a violation of the one-person, one-vote rule. Not our state governments. Once the Supreme Court threw out the Voting Rights Act, 23 states, nearly half the states in the Union, enacted restrictive voting laws, from reducing the number of polling places to the purging of voting rolls to stricter and stricter voter ID requirements. The country is in pain. Our democracy is under attack. Who's going to save us? We are. We're going to vote. Every one of us is going to go out and vote, no matter how difficult, no matter how complicated it is during a pandemic. All of you who voted in the primary, good for you. All of you who voted via absentee ballots, good for you. All of you who voted via early voting, good for you. All of you who stood in line for hours around the few polling places that were available on primary day, who waited patiently because you valued your right to vote more than the inconvenience, good for you. You're going to do that in the general election too. But we're going to do more than that. We're already doing more than that. Under the auspices of You the Vote here at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Hudson Valley, we've sent out hundreds of letters to people to make sure that they were registered to vote. We've sent out thousands of postcards to urge people to vote. We're in the process of sending out thousands more letters and postcards right before the election to remind people, to urge people to vote. We're calling on you to help us, to join us, as you did when we were all able to meet in person together and we had our tables in the fellowship hall, only now we're going to do it socially distanced. We can change those institutions that aren't helping us now. They don't have to be this way, and we can make them better by our votes, by all our votes. Why? Why are we going to do it? Because, as Stacey Abrams says, voting is an act of faith. It is profound. In a democracy, it is the ultimate power. Through the vote, the poor can access financial means, the infirm can find healthcare support, and the burdened and heavy laden can receive a measure of relief from a social safety net that serves all. And we are willing to go to war to defend the sacred. Because we're Unitarian Universalists, and we covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and the society at large, our fifth principle, which flows directly from our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, because we know what's at stake. As the Reverend Stephanie May said, what is at issue is safeguarding the unabridged right to vote, the consent of the governed, and the vision of equality that gives each person a voice without regard of race, color, sex, or gender. Fighting voter suppression is about the ethics of whose voice matters and the theological values of the worth and dignity of every person. It is about loving our neighbors as complete persons with voices that have a right to be counted. Our country is in pain. Our democracy is under attack. Who's going to save us? We are. Join us.
So what are we doing as a congregation to help fulfill the promise of democracy? Among the many actions suggested in the UU the Vote toolkit that came out of the 2016 Statement of Conscience on Democracy, our UU the Vote team chose to support electoral justice campaigns. The first is Reclaim Our Vote, led by community organizers of color to help fight voter suppression in southern states with at least 20% population of color and a history of voter suppression. The second is Vote Forward, a nonpartisan organization to target traditionally underrepresented voters or voters who are unlikely to vote in 6 swing states, and urge them to register to vote and to get out and vote. We collaborate with several local nonpartisan organizations to build a team of over 80 volunteers for both campaigns. Since February, we have sent over 3,500 voter registration and GOTV letters for Vote Forward and over 3,650 postcards for Reclaim Our Vote. While attending the UUA General Assembly this past week, UU volunteers called 114,000 Texas voters targeted for voter suppression on behalf of Reclaim Our Vote. So there are phone banking and text banking campaigns as well to support. We will continue with these 2 writing campaigns until the fall elections. There are other opportunities to get involved if you prefer phone banking or texting programs. We're starting our 3rd postcard writing campaign this coming Thursday, July 10th. Won't you help? Please check the UU the Vote notices in the weekly e-news or contact the co-chairs, Daria Gregg or Ginny Stillman. Now for a few testimonials from several members of the team. Leah Nelson writes, "Injustices of any kind has always really bothered me. My mother was a feminist and cultural anthropologist. Growing up in Queens, I understood the systemic nature of racism from an early age. Before I retired from my job, I always wished that I had time to do political activism work. Now is the time. In joining this congregation, I feel fortunate to have met like-minded people who I can work with and learn from. Our democracy has been seriously threatened in the past 3.5 years. The perils and insanity that are on the horizon of the current administration are incomprehensible. Meanwhile, there's a grave injustice being perpetrated on minority groups of people by state governments to influence the outcomes of elections, voter suppression. It is not free and fair. It is unjust, unconstitutional, and undemocratic. It rails against my conscience and rails against all of the UU principles. I feel highly motivated to do this work because of the importance that every voice be counted in the upcoming elections." Linda Griffin writes, "I think our 5th principle is more relevant now than any time in recent history because it's not just a statement, but a call to action, and act we must." Here is an excerpt from Man the Reluctant Brother by Mather E. Spetter, written in 1967. "In a time of heightened crisis, Extreme vigilance is necessary if freedom is to survive. Freedom to think, to ask questions, to suggest alternatives, and to liberate the nation from fear and hatred. These are goals for a liberal America. Their realization demands the commitment of persons and not ideologies. Ginny Stillman writes, I feel compassionate about trying to live the UU Fifth principle in today's world of social, racial, and economic injustice. I feel that I must act to ensure that all voices in our democracy are heard through their vote. Maybe it is the debt and ongoing responsibility to preceding generations, and maybe it's the underlying Unitarian Universalism faith and values that have helped shape me and given me a voice to act. To quote from a Unitarian minister, Edward Everett Hale, I am only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. The something I ought to do, I can do. I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. Each week,
Our closing words are from Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Let us reconstitute the world together. And now please join us in our closing hymn, which is This Little Light of Mine. The words will be on the screen.